Hi, this is Rex from universalexports.co, bringing you a fortnightly podcast called A Story to Tell. In this series, we hear from an eclectic group of people whose only connection is through being a member of the Camberwell Petanque Club. By research, gentle prodding, and sometimes coercion, these guests unfold a labyrinth of achievements, disappointments, and surprises. You may be inspired, shocked, or even doubtful, but you will be enthralled. And your turn is coming, so get ready for that tap on the shoulder because everyone has a story to tell. Our next guest, a member of the Camberwell Petanque Club, has had an extraordinary career with a number of international companies around the world, particularly in France. He was appointed chairman of the Australian France Foundation, founded by Prime Ministers Rocard Hawk. He was made a Chevalier National Order of Merit. He has over 100 menus from the top restaurants in France. Among many other appointments, he was Delegue Payee for Rhone, Poulenc, Director of Stem Cell Sciences KK, on the board of what was to become the National Stroke Foundation. In one day, he was forced to enjoy copious quantities of Dom Perignon Champange. He enjoys playing tennis, chamber music, and of course petanque. He didn't enjoy being swept overboard in Bass Strait. In 2024, he and his wife Libby spent 71 nights away travelling and taking in over 30 music concerts. He has over 600 framed photographs in the entranceway of his home. He has a story to tell. This is David Newton. David, even from the beginning, you had an interesting start. Where were you born? Where exactly were you born?
I was born in the bedroom of my mother's home. I had three brothers, and the family shifted to a house opposite Stonington, which was really a sort of mansion house with a tennis court in the back and a chook yard and also a dugout, because it was during the war that we were there.
So it was unusual to be born in the house in the first instance, but is it true that you weren't even allowed in the living room or the lounge room until you were age 11?
Oh yes, a very Victorian sort of upbringing, I think. I was brought up by a nurse, and I guess my mother as well. I never ate in the dining room until I was about 11. And my next eldest brother, and there were three of them, he had the same thing, eating probably at 10 or something. So it was unusual because in our house we had a maid, a cook, a nurse, a gardener, and a chauffeur for my father, who was a medico and an important one at that.
And you didn't see very much of him?
No, he was the top person at the Alfred. Everyone I spoke to about him said he was such a nice man and so kind and so on and so forth, and such a good doctor. But in a sense, apart from going down to our Flinders property, which he did for a little while, but he tended to escape away because he, in later life, had a heart problem and so on.
David, tell me about your schooling and how did that lead on to where you ended up in industry?
I spent my primary school years at Wadhurst, Melbourne Grammar. I was 12 and I was summoned into my father's study. My mother was there, and I was told midway through my last year of primary school at Wadhurst that I was going next week to board at Geelong Grammar's primary school halfway through the year. And that was tough.
That must have been a shock. How did you fit into this sudden new and, dare I say, foreign lifestyle?
Well, I think in my times at Geelong at boarding, I was a bit of an introvert and a loner, probably immature. I grew out of that after I'd finished. I got a Commonwealth Scholarship in my first year of matric, which I did with humanities, and the headmaster told my parents that I was too immature to go to university and I should do a second year matric. So I decided if I was going to do a second year matric, I would do physics and chemistry from scratch.
You had set yourself quite a bit of a challenge. How did you do in the exams?
Now, I never sat the exam because I would never have passed it, but the two dominant themes in my life have been the French and science-based companies and research.
So when did you first actually get involved in those industries?
Firstly, I went to Melbourne University and I studied a commerce degree, and I realised that that was too confining, and I decided to do an arts degree as well.
Did you have time to fit in any sort of social life?
The early ages of having got out of monastic life, I tended to enjoy not only alcohol too much, but also girls, I suppose. So that was a bit of turbulence until I met Libby, who set me on the straight and narrow path. I also, because I'd failed some subjects, my mother set me up to work for a small company called Aluminium Engineering, which made windows, and I was a boy Friday, which was a fantastic experience, and then I went back to university. So I joined Comalco Aluminium as the assistant to the finance manager, and we were dealing with all sorts of financing and double taxation issues. That was fun, and then I was transferred to Sydney to be the Sydney office accountant with 5 Americans and 6 Australians, which was a fascinating experience. But in that, I went to some seminars there, and one was on the IBM 360 computer. So I thought, oh, this is going to be a major difference to the world. I better get on with this. And beside it, there was someone from ICI Australia, and they were putting in a new IBM 360. So I decided I'd join them, and I got offered a job and took it up. I was a system analyst, and I designed a marketing and sales information system.
But you didn't have any background in computering.
No. Nothing ventured, nothing gained.
And were you and Libby married at this stage?
Yes, we were married. We had one child when we got to Sydney. Unfortunately, I made a rather stupid decision. We bought a house in Pymble. We should have gone to the North Shore. Anyway, I'd studied psychology at Sydney University.
Just for something to do, was it? Just a bit of another add-on.
It was part of my arts degree. So I then was transferring back to Melbourne, and I had to do a language to complete my arts degree. However, the university wrote to me and said I could choose a subject out of a set of languages, and one of them was the history of art and architecture from early Mesopotamian days till about 1920. A fascinating subject. And when I started to travel, and I did when I became the manager of the films business, I decided to put myself in a non-Anglais country every time I visited London. And I visited London twice a year. And so I wanted to go to Italy, but it was much easier and cheaper to go to France. So I visited France for twice a year. So this is the beginning of my French love affair, if you like, or involvement.
And a love affair it was indeed. One of the positions, David, you took on was on a Japanese island. What was that?
I was a director of Stem Cell Sciences KK, a Japanese company based in Kobe, and I attended board meetings on the island there. A bit unusual for an Australian, the company was partly owned by Stem Cell Sciences in Australia, of which I was on the board. I was also on the board of what became the National Stroke Foundation with Sir John Holland as the chair. And we took it in the end from a local foundation to be the National Stroke Foundation, which was a big achievement, and it's a really important help, if you like, to people who have stroke. And stroke is so important to get to a hospital quickly.
And you were on that for how long, Dave?
10 years.
But you also brought adventure to your family and home life. Your friends, the Housemans, who had a 20-acre property, were going to the UK for a year. You decided to rent it from them.
No, if I can say, I was head of the Parents Association at Lauriston Girls' School, and then I was on the school council. And after that, I struck on the idea of renting this farm and living on it and giving my two daughters an experience of farm and rural life.
And this is how you got involved in horses and, coincidentally, sailing.
Yes. We had all sorts of extraordinary adventures. They had 2 cows. We had to loosen the barbed wire to let the cows jump over the field where the bull was, and then they had to come back. Unfortunately, one of them tore its teat, and I had to fix it up. Luckily, I had a retired dairy farmer down the street who grew ducks. He helped me, and we had to put up a thing and wash the teat. And one morning, I'd forgotten the bowl of water to wash the teat. Before I put the antibiotic up, I tied the cow up. I went back to the house, got the water, came out, looked, there was no cow. And I said, this is not possible. So I ran to the stockyard, and the cow was lying flat on its back, one eye going one way and the other eye going the other way. I called out to Libby, I've killed the cow, and I quickly untied it, and suddenly it awoke.
Your powers as a vet surprised even you. The family's immersion in the true farm experience continued in greater depths, didn't it?
And we also had 2 sheep that gave birth to lambs. Well, a neighbour had a Doberman dog that he left off, and the Doberman dog had killed the chooks before we got there. And he was let off after about a couple of months, and the lambs were called Billy and Millie, and unfortunately he killed Billy. So then the other lamb grew into a nice lamb, and the Doberman dog got off again, and I got there at the time, but it was too late, so I had to take Millie down to the dairy farmer, dress it and gut it, and send it off to the butcher. Brought it back from the butcher, and I served a leg of lamb for lunch on a Sunday, and I made the mistake of telling my daughters that this was Millie, and they got up and left the table.
Well, they certainly learned about farm life very quickly. David, that farm was in Eltham, but you had a close attachment to Flinders on Western Port Bay.
My father and mother built a house in 1947, I think, at Flinders on the golf course. My uncle had a house on the golf course. Medicos, all who were knighted, including my father, who had these houses. And I used to go to the beach and spearfish and do all sorts of things like that as I grew up as a boy. So it was my spiritual home.
Priority.
So when my mother died, I bought 5 acres, which had a chook shed on it, which was removed. But before building a house, I put up a tennis court.
As a matter of logical priority, yes, I see that. And Libby and you built this house together?
It was a merchant builder's kit home, and Libby and I put it up with the help of a student. It was great. We had great fun going to the beach, and we had New Year's Eve parties with friends, and all the friends had built houses too. So we used to take the children to each other's house, and they would play, and we would enjoy the adults. The children had to find somewhere to sleep, and then about 2 o'clock we used to try and find where they were and take them home.
This is where you started getting involved with sailing too, was it?
Yep. Well, we started out firstly with the Main Ridge Pony Club. Because we'd had these ponies at Eltham, we had 2 ponies and I had a horse. My children used to ride to Pony Club. Other people had horse floats, but I thought it was good to ride. So we were involved in that. And then the Point Leo Boat Club, the members were dying off, so they wanted an intake of members. They offered it to the Main Ridge Pony Club, and we all joined together. And at that stage, I had a plastic boat for my children called a topper, which was like a mini laser. And I'd taught them once they could right the boat, they could go off on their own. And that's what they did. Now, when we got to Point Leo Boat Club, some of the guys and myself decided that we needed a boat as well as the children. I suggested a laser.
A laser being a single-handed small dinghy.
We all bought lasers and we raced the lasers. Now, the waves in Western Port come in from Bass Strait, past Flinders and past Point Leo, so it can be wild. I always thought that the laser had inbuilt instability, and I bottled a lot and righted the boat. Now that paid off. I bought with 2 other people a 9.2 metre Far sailing boat, and we were sailing it back to Port Phillip, to Brighton, I think. We'd rung the Lonsdale Light to say that we were coming and would it be okay, and they said, yes, it will, but give us a ring when you get to Cape Schenck. So we did that, and they said, don't come, it's 40-knot winds, 4-metre waves and breaking, go back. So we turned around, there was myself, another partner in the boat, and a novice. And because we'd reefed the sail on the way down, I decided I'd get up on the deck, tie up the sail, so it was tidy. My partner, who was steering, saw that the novice was going up to help me, and we had no places to tie ourselves on the deck. He took his eye off the direction. We were running with the wind. I was over the boom, and suddenly he did an involuntary jibe, and I was thrown into the water off Bushrangers Bay in 3-metre waves breaking.
That would have been devastating. How did you cope?
Because of this experience with the laser, I had no fear. I had absolutely no fear. I was quite confident in the water that I would get back on the boat, and all I had to do was go about, and I had to decide which side of the boat do I go. I decided I'd go the windward side, and I slid along the hull, and I got a hold of the safety lines, and no one was there. They were all looking for me on the leeward side. Anyway, I survived.
So, still down, or have you moved up here at this stage?
Yes, we had this house, and eventually we decided we'd quit the horses, and we were wanting to buy a property where we could see the sea, walk to the beach, and walk to a shop. And we found a property at the bottom of Cliff Road, that's in Shoreham, and we built a 6-bedroom, fantastic house with a view of the bay. Just walking through the pines to Shoreham Beach, it was magic. We built it so that our children and grandchildren could come down and be with us, and that worked for a while.
So there's your home life, based around farming, horsing and sailing, which all sounds pretty spectacular. But what's happening with your career at this stage?
What I didn't say was that I was in charge of a business about $100 million turnover when we decided to put up this house. And I took about 8 days off work, and we put it up nearly to lock up stage at that point. It was a kid home. There was one part where an architect friend, Darryl Jackson, had designed a fireplace for us that we hadn't built, and we had to prop up the ceiling and the roof with a pole. It started to rain, so I said to Libby and my daughters, I had to go back to work. Seeing it was raining, could they bail out the roof so that the whole thing didn't collapse? So that was a start. When I finished that job, and I only held down a job for 3 years up until I joined Rhone Poulenc, which I'll mention, because I had to get a promotion in order to get sufficient salary to be able to pay the private school fees. And it was always a hassle or a tussle to get there. So I had to do well and get myself promoted. Anyway, I got sent to MIT for a business school. And when I came back, I ran the RCI's biologicals businesses, which were pharmaceutical, animal health, agrochemicals, and diagnostics and consumer products. And again, that was a very successful thing that I managed to do. In both cases, I'd lifted the profits from 3 million to 12 million in 3 years. I got then offered a job with Cooper's Animal Health in the UK as commercial director. And I have to say, I didn't do that well. Unfortunately, Libby had to stay behind with my second daughter because of finishing her high school. And I missed her wisdom. And I think in that job I stuffed up. So
Time to have another challenge then.
I had to rebuild. I managed to get a job as the chief executive of Rhone Poulenc for Australia and New Zealand. It was called Delegue Payee. That sort of followed my interest in France.
That comment is all the more interesting given the fact that you had given up studying French at the leaving certificate level. How did you get on with the French?
I found the French actually very easy to deal with. You had to adjust as an Anglais person to the French way of thinking. The French don't make decisions in meetings. They make decisions in the couloir or the salon or the restaurant. Knowing all this, I used to make sure I briefed a number of people. When they talked to each other, they'd say, oh, David's got this proposal or something. So it wasn't new. And it worked. So I had that, and I continued to go to France. And in addition to that, it was at the stage of completion of the French nuclear testing in the Pacific.
Isn't it amazing how that nuclear testing added to your career?
Yes, it is. And Prime Ministers Hawk and Rocard got together, and they decided to form a foundation called the Australia-France Foundation. I was appointed the chair from the Australian side. I had a full-time director in the Paris embassy. It was exciting. We would lunch with senior executives of French companies.
I've seen evidence of that. I think you've got over 100 menus of the different restaurants that you've been, signed by most of the top chefs.
That's right. Yes. It was just something that I thought, oh, I'm doing this, may as well collect the menus. Bit different, but I did. And because they were regulars there, the restaurant, of course, would give me the menu. So that was exciting.
Fantastic.
I have to add one thing. Because of my involvement with the embassy, I had decided that I wanted to have a French associate working with me who could communicate back to the officers in La Défense and knew the way they functioned. And so I put forward a proposal to the Immigration Department to have this assistant approved. I got knocked back. I got knocked back 2 or 3 times. So I went to appeal. And the appeal tribunal was a one-man tribunal. I said, look, all the other heads of French companies are French. And I need someone who's French, but not only French, but has to understand how the bureaus work in France and be able to ring up the manager's assistant and say to him, David sent through this email and he really needs a reply. This is what it's all about. So the assistant would bully the manager to get a reply for me. Yep. So it worked well in the end. So I said to the tribunal, this is what I want. He said, that seems perfectly reasonable. And he gave me the approval and also 3 years on the visa. Oh. Which was unusual.
Yeah.
So I was in Paris and I selected the girl and I sent her off to the embassy. She came back and she said they knocked me back. because I knew the embassy people, I rang up the head of the immigration area there, and I said, look, I've been through purgatory to get this approval, and if it's not fixed by tomorrow, all hell will break loose. Anyway, I sent her off in the morning, and down she went, and she came back. Have you got the visa? Yes. For 3 years? No. Why not? Because my passport only had 1 year. So I'm on the record books of winning a case against the Immigration Department.
Excellent. Congratulations on winning that appeal. Stunning. But you've also picked up a few other awards.
Yeah, well, for services to French industry and commerce, the French have 2 awards, one which was founded by Bonaparte, the Legionnaire, and the other one founded by Charles de Gaulle, which was the Chevalier National Order de Merit.
So you are a knight.
In French terms.
Your career with Rhone continues.
Poulenc had a big interest in rare earths and wanted to establish a plant in Western Australia where it already had a gallium plant. I took over running the proposal, and I had all sorts of meetings, which were public meetings in Coolgardie, Kalgoorlie, Southern Cross, Pinjarra and Perth and other places, and they all went the same way. It was like you were standing up in front and you were naked and you didn't know what was going to happen. But funnily, each one went the same way. And each time, the people who were there to be informed and maybe objecting said, well, thank God someone's listening to us, even if the government isn't. In the end, we put this proposal through and we got it approved, including a radioactive waste disposal place, low-level radioactive waste, north of Laverton.
Radioactive disposal concepts usually hit a lot of barriers. You must have experienced problems.
There was a lot of concern. When you talk about radioactive, people tend to jump to birth defects, leukemia, and all sorts of other things which weren't really relevant, but they feel it. We got the project approved, but the Chinese then gave us a price which we couldn't afford to build the plant. And unfortunately, if the plant had been built, it would have been such a gold mine today.
You were away in Western Australia quite a lot. What was Libby up to at those times?
Libby was supervising these townhouses while I was away quite often in Perth.
A project not for the faint-hearted and completed very successfully, I can say, by enjoying the result here today. And then you retired from Rhone Poulenc. You were appointed to the board of Monash University Institute of Reproduction and Development.
Well, I was trying to help a business called the Animal Gene Bank, which was to preserve the genes of animals that were going extinct. So that's how I got there. Then I'd helped coordinate the first Victorian government's biotech strategy. I became on the board of a public company which started as a New Zealand company, became a dual company in Australia, and which we took global and became number 3 in the world in the field of resin manufacture. That was an exciting thing. And I also was on the board of the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation, and I ended up supervising a stem cell science business. It was extraordinary given that I had a commercial background, if you like, and that the 2 dominant themes of my life have been the French and science and research.
All of this when you gave up French and leaving and studied chemistry and physics from scratch in the second year matric after gaining the Commonwealth Scholarship that you mentioned earlier. You studied management programs at MIT.
Subsequently, I did some training at IMI in Geneva. I also went to CDEP at INSEAD Fontainebleau, studying negotiation skills, which was a fantastic thing to do.
Family means a lot to you, David. One way you showed it was in a very generous gesture. You and Libby helped out the kids and the grandkids, I believe.
Oh, yes. We had 3 daughters, Jane, Mandy and Emma, and we ended up with 8 grandchildren. Sophie, Freya, Max, Greta, Rory, Fred, Will, and Charlotte. Libby and I decided that we needed to help our daughters, and we helped them into housing. So we then decided to pay for the secondary schooling for all their grandchildren, and for two of them we actually did pay something in primary school. So overall that has cost me about $4 million. But so am I richer or poorer? Well, poorer to the extent of $4 million, but richer in the sense of being able to help my daughters and my grandchildren while I was alive and see how well they've all turned out. It's just a joy to be able to help them when you're alive.
What a magnificent situation. Excellent. One of your major interests, David, was music, but you've got other interests as well, involving sport.
Yes, well, my interests are tennis now, sailing, and petanque. And I've had a lot of fun at all of them.
And I know about petanque because you've beat me so many times. Actually, you do very well at the Flinders Club.
Well, I was fourth on the honours board last year, so I felt good about that. And last week I was second.
We just touched on sailing a little bit, David, and sailing is close to my heart as well. In fact, was there a stage where you had a boat that I yearned for, which was a Beneteau? What was the story behind that?
The Beneteaus. Four of us bought a Beneteau 35.7, a racing type rather than straight cruising, but it was a cruiser. And funnily enough, the four people were myself, my friend from school, Tim Cormack, Ian Freer, and John Collingwood. And would you believe that John Collingwood was related to Admiral Collingwood, and I was related to John McCanch, who was Admiral Collingwood's fleet surgeon. What a coincidence.
That's just amazing.
I was very grateful to Libby because she allowed me, she thought I needed something to do, so sailing became something to do, and I retired. And we raced the boat at Brighton, and we won 3 years in a row the championship for Wednesday sailing. That involved 12 of the series in 3 years. So that was a phenomenal achievement, and to do that we had to make improvements every year because the handicap would penalise us. Of course. So we had improvements by getting someone who was very good at sail trimming. We got new sails. We learned about how to go on the wind, and we cruised both yachts all around Bass Strait. It's like a boy's own venture, but the biggest one was cruising around Tasmania.
Really?
Yeah, which was a fantastic experience, and I'm so grateful to Libby because we were away for a month letting me do that. The last leg was from Deal Island to Queenscliff. We breakfasted at Deal Island, and then we left with a storm coming up, and we thought we might beat it. In the middle of the night, I was down on my bunk sleeping, and an argument broke out between one of the partners and a sailor who was a bit of a novice, right, who joined us for the last leg. Anyway, I thought the best thing I can do is send my mate down and sort it out. Well, the wind had come up at that point, and they were trying to sort things out. Anyway, I took over. There were 3-metre waves breaking, and we were parallel. So every time I looked at the wave, I had to make a judgment as to whether the wave was going to break, in which case I'd turn up into it. If it didn't, we'd go on. Right. And we went past Cape Schanck. We rang the lighthouse then to see if it was okay, and they asked us what our boat was, and they said, "You'll be all right." And this was not slack water. We had to go in, and otherwise the storm was going to get worse. So we had a dichotomy of what to do. But we decided to run, and they said, just keep north of the lighthouse and go straight on, within 200 metres of the rocks on the Point Lonsdale side. So we did that. The sail even got more interesting in my terms. Not only do we have 3-metre waves breaking, we had steeps in the rip. So I had to judge whether to turn up into the wave or not. And whenever we turned up in the wave, the boat shook. We finally got back and kept on going. Now, John Collingwood was actually looking at us on the lighthouse, from the lighthouse, and someone said, "Look at those fools. What on earth are they doing?" Anyway, we got to 200 metres of the rocks. Everything calmed down, and I pointed to Queenscliff, and then my partner shouted, "Rocks ahead." Well, I knew the chart. I knew there were no rocks, but what they were two seals with their fins running up. Anyway.
One of your major... As we've seen earlier, we have known you to be late on occasions. Almost a reputation, I would think, at times, David. Yeah. But there was one occasion where luck turned out to be on your side.
Oh, yes. My view, as I've said, is luck is the management of opportunity. And one such occasion, when I was chair of the Australia-France Foundation, I got invited to meet an Australian artist in residence at Moe in Épinay, France. My middle daughter, Mandy, who was probably about 20 at that time, was meeting me in Paris. So I asked if she could accompany me. So we were told to catch the train to Épinay at 11 a.m. and we were to be picked up at 12:15 for lunch in the chateau.
Sounds nice.
Yeah, before having a tour of the limestone caves, where they keep and turn each bottle of champagne. Well, the train stopped in a ravine around 11:50 a.m. And eventually a voice came over the loudspeaker in the train. "Je suis désolé, un accident en ligne." And we waited and we waited and we waited, and finally a voice came over. "Je suis désolé, une personne morte en ligne." So we waited and waited, and eventually we managed to get to Épinay at 2:15. I was very apologetic. They said, "Pas a problem, pas a problem." Drove me to the chateau, and we were welcomed with a glass of Dom Perignon. Oh. And then we were taken into dinner into a small dining room of the chateau, which is decorated yellow and blue like Monet's garden or house.
Yes.
And there were four of us. We had full silver service, waiters with long white gloves and black ties, etc. And my daughter had never, ever seen anything like it. And we went through Vintage Brut and Mark, and then we went out to the caves, went around and ended up in the tasting cave, and again some more Vintage Brut. They put us up at the Royal Champagne, and in our room was a bottle of Vintage Brut. And then we were taken out to dinner there, and again we had some Vintage Brut. So, oh dear, that was a memorable event, but it followed by a visit the next day to Dom Perignon's laboratory, and that was something special. And we went after that to lunch, and they asked us if we'd like to have a tour of Rhone's cathedral with a priest to take us round. Well, I'm not religious, but I'd been to Rhone's before, but I couldn't not have that. So it was such an event.
So two things to be learned. One, being late isn't always a problem sometimes.
No.
And you did say it was memorable. After all that champagne, I'm very surprised at that. Earlier on, you mentioned you spent a lot of time, Shoreham, Flinders area. You referred to it as your spiritual home. Why is that?
Well, my spiritual home is Flinders, Shoreham. I take them together. As I first visited when I was about 4 and stayed at either St Andrew's Guest House overlooking Western Port, or at my uncle's, Sir Alan Newton, a surgeon who managed the sourcing of medical supplies for Australia during the war. His house was called Phoenix Cottage, located behind the Flinders Golf Course. Later, I remember 2 years in a row staying at Sir Clive Fitt's house at the bottom of Beach Road in Shoreham, looking over Western Port Bay to Phillip Island, and located above the creek that I played, as later did our children and grandchildren. My father, who was also knighted for services to medicine as Sir Wilberforce Stephen Newton, a chest physician at the Alfred, and my mother built a house beside the Flinders Golf Course, at that time the 12th Fairway. And we also inherited a bathing box on the ocean beach. I spent my younger years walking through the golf course in the morning, swimming and spearfishing. Then in the afternoon, I went sailing in a top hat yacht with Sir Hugh Devine, another medico, or going out in a 14-foot clinker wooden fishing boat with my eldest brother, John, to fish. John loved tinkering with the Blacksman Chapman pup engine, and I remember after fishing turning around to my frustration to find the engine in pieces, and all I wanted to do was get back on land. I also was taken out by Andy Johansson, a fisherman and family friend, in a beautiful cooter boat called Muriel. Sometimes with the swell and the smell of diesel mixed with the smell of rather rancid bait for the crayfish pot, I was sick. We often went under sail, so much better than the smell of diesel, to Cape Schanck to pull up the crayfish pots, put them back with new bait. Other times we went surfing at Point Leo, particularly when the wind came from the west. In my later years when I was at boarding school, I initially went there by steam train, and which is also unusual. We always went to Flinders for vacation. I was fortunate as there was a group of boys and girls, and we had such fun going to each other's parties, musical evenings, and I remember having my first love affairs. Such a joy. We also went to movies in the community hall and bought fresh warm bread from the baker. So much better than being locked up in a monastic school during terms.
Absolutely. David, you with Libby's support have had such a fantastic career in leadership positions in science-based industries, both internationally and in Australia.
I've had a broad life, if you like.
Extremely interesting broad life too.
In a sense, I say I achieved that in spite of Geelong Grammar, where I went to boarding school, but also because of it, in a sense, because in those days there were networks that one could access, and I'm sure that helped in getting some of the jobs that I did. On the other hand, I sort of say I'm a bit of a self-made man because I drove myself to achieve, to do this, at a time when my parents had been downwardly mobile in wealth terms.
Congratulations on everything that you've achieved. You've talked all about your career, your family, but there are other loves in your life too, aren't there?
Yes. Well, one of them is music now, and I wasn't musical as a young person. In fact, in our house we didn't have music. We listened to Biggles during the war and all sorts of other things, but although we did have a gramophone, and in where I was brought up, the nursery, once a month the nursery would change into a dance floor for dancing class for my two elder brothers and people around. And we had one of those gramophones that you cranked up and put the hard disc on, and away it went. But I was taken to bed. My next elder brother was taken out by my nurse to see a film, and the elder boys and women, or girls I should say, danced the night away.
When you were travelling Europe so often, you had opportunities to enjoy some cultural icons.
So when I started to travel, apart from putting myself in France, I made a decision to go to the opera houses of where I was in, not so much for love of music, but I loved the ambience. So I made a personal decision to go to places like Covent Garden, which I've been to 27 times, to the Opera Garnier for the ballet in Paris, to La Scala, La Fenice, and other places. And that kindled my interest in music. And now Libby and I have been to over 30 concerts so far this year. We've got 2 more to go. And these are primarily chamber music. We have been away from home. You know, she's had dementia. We've been away from home for 71 nights so far this year, which is extraordinary, and the doctors didn't think I could do it. Music has played a big role. Libby loves music, and we use music to help change moods. And I'm in the process of a Melbourne University research project on how music can help people with dementia. And it is extraordinary. It's really good.
Well done. What a story you have to tell in the time of your extensive and outstanding career journey. Together, you and Libby visited over 30 countries, built 7 houses, all supervised by Libby, actually owned 10 houses plus a block of land, and you have lived in Melbourne, Sydney and Berkhamsted in England.
I just wanted to say, Libby came with me on many trips and we had such fun. In fact, the last one was only in 2019, and we went to London, Paris, through Scandinavia, to St. Petersburg and to Ireland. We had 4 themes: adventure, music, good food, and to follow an ancestor trail. I had so many adventures with my daughters and my grandchildren, but I'm going to let them tell that tale.
That just shows what you can achieve when you don't enjoy boarding school and don't sit a Year 11 exam. David's achievements and legacies are truly inspiring. And I didn't get to ask him which of all of those French restaurants he thought was the best. So why don't you when you see him next? As we fade out to the sounds of Max Thomas on the conga drums, I thank you all for joining us here at universalexports.co. Tune in a fortnight's time to meet our next guest, who will amaze and enthrall you with his engrossing story to tell. Rex out.